This should be going live, and we're live. Hey, everybody, it's the Love First Christians. I'm Hody Johns. I'm here with Aaron Goss, and we are here to bring you the good news this week in the middle of a whole bunch of bad news. We're going to talk about our Bible readings. We are currently 4% of the way through the Bible. Yay. Congratulations to us. As of today, we're doing the Bible in 1 year. We're going to talk about our readings. Aaron, if you don't mind, I was thinking we'd start more with the current event stuff and end with the Bible stuff, if that's okay with you. It's just what's on my mind. Usually I start with the Bible stuff and go from there. But we ended last time by talking about this video by That Dang Dad, about this hip hop video. Do you want to describe it a little bit? You probably know more of the details than I do.
So I almost passed this video up because even though I love That Dang Dad, I'm not big on hip hop. I listen to it, but I'm not a big hip hop fan. And so he just starts talking about this song that he's heard called Steven. It's something Steven. I don't remember. There's another word in there. And it's about how he got the singer gets to his apartment with a friend of his, and it's obviously been pilfered through. And once they end up determining what's going on, it's a local vagrant who had been high on drugs and had gone through his apartment, put on a bunch of his clothes, rifled through his things, and was like sitting in his kitchen or something like that, eating something out of his fridge or whatever. And he goes to talk to the police and the apartment manager, and the apartment manager is like, yeah, that's just Steve. He a couple of years ago, he was crashing with a friend of his in this apartment complex, and the friend was like, okay, this situation's untenable. I can't help you anymore. And Steven basically never left. Like, he's in and out of the apartment complex constantly, having problems with the police and everything. And then the police show up and they start interrogating Steven and interrogating the person who's gotten their house broken to. Of course, this is all a song that he's singing about the situation. And yeah, I mean, it comes down to what's to be done with Steven. Like the cops in front of Steven, like they refuse to pull him aside and talk to him, have this conversation with the guy, and they're like, yeah, we could book him and take him down to jail and arrest him, or you can cut him loose. It's up to you. And they make it very clear through pressure that they rather him just cut it loose because it's too much paperwork to have to deal with. And the guy's like, so I'm put in this situation where I'm determining whether or not somebody goes free or goes to jail. I don't want either of those situations to happen. I mean, the guy's like broken into my house. He's violated my security, but I don't want him to go to jail over it. I want him to get help. And the police don't have anything to offer him in that regard. I mean, he didn't even mention it to the police because the police aren't going to do that. They're not going to get him help. And so the That Dang Dad video is about the song, and it's more than just how do we get Steven help and like the Stevens of the world, how do we get them help? It's also a rumination on the singer of the song. Like, how do you get past having that violation of your security? And the aftermath of it. I mean, obviously there's the physical possessions, like Steven had thrown some of his records in the sink and stuff like that, and books in the sink, with water all over them. So that, stuff was damaged. But how do you get that feeling of security back in your home where you feel like it's safe? Yeah. And that's kind of the story that he told in that song.
Yeah, and the conclusion that he draws is we usually talk a lot about, we focus a lot about Steven on these types of, songs in the real world. We're like, oh, there's, all these people and how do we help them best? And a lot of times we forget about the person who's had their house broken into, right? And their sanctity violated, their stuff thrown into the sink and soaked, like what's in the songs, right? Like some irreplaceable belongings were destroyed. And when we call for, and that dang dad certainly, I won't say he comes from the right. He comes from the left. He comes from the right, but he's certainly on the left right now. And his like perspective and the people he communicates with are certainly more. They oftentimes forget about, hey, when I call for police prohibition, I need to offer the people who have been harmed something. I can't just say like, oh, suck it up, it'll be fine, there's worse problems out there. Like there has to
We'll
be
figure it
something for
out.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll figure it out then, and I completely agree. I think the same way, because I too am all about police prohibition, ICE prohibition. At the same time, I don't want to just be like, oh, was your house broken into by an immigrant? I don't care. Like I need to show that I care more and not less than my opponents. You know what I mean? Like that is, and certainly the call for Christians that we have to have, that we need to be showing people that we care more about their problems, as opposed to like, well, you can't just suck this up. We're trying to do something really great here. Because if you just suck up problems like that, like you're just creating more problems. And why do people want to just trade their problems for other problems? It's not fair. And it's good that I think it's good that we can at least acknowledge that we push for, people like me and you and that dang dad can push for police prohibition and opening borders and, all these great, wonderful things. But, don't lose sight of the fact that people do deserve a home. Don't lose the fact that people deserve a place to call their own, the sense of safety, a sense of security, a sense of justice. Yeah. And I like the idea that, that dang dad is a former cop. We're actually going to talk about him in a minute again here. I even put him in the title of this video here because we're going to talk about another video that he's got. But being a former cop, coming up with that whole like, I don't want to deal with this. And the best way to do it is to convince the person to kind of not press charges by, or the best way to get the no justice for them is to be like, well, you want to press charges? You want to throw them in jail? Because it's either that or nothing, right? There's no get the person some help, get them some psychiatric therapy, get them a home to stay in for a little bit. There's, the government makes this very difficult. And we're libertarians. We interviewed somebody in Indiana, and they had the most successful it sounds terrible, but anti-homeless program in the country. And by that, I mean taking the homeless and getting them in homes and having them stay in homes. And what they did was had them work. And then at first they would take care of their bills, pay, and just be like, listen, as you're working, here's the money that you have, right? Like $600 this week. And I'm going to pay this phone bill, and see, now here's your phone, and I'm going to pay this apartment bill. See, here's your apartment. And they kind of slowly hand the baton from one to the other to have them doing it. These places are largely illegal. The government goes after very few facilities more than these types. And it's really embarrassing because they don't want this in between. They either want you outside or inside. And especially as we're reading the Bible this week, talk about flawed people, even the heroes. Like, we are all remarkably flawed people. And to act like we are all either the good guys or the bad guys it's not feasible in this world where we're all a mix of gray. Every single one of us. It's not fair. It's not right. And it just doesn't work. Aaron, any other thoughts about that video before we carry on?
Well, yeah. So I had a thought about something that was related to that. It was specifically in relation to the conversation we were having about getting rid of things without having a plan in place for what comes next. I was having a conversation with a couple of the CLC folks on the CLC Discord, Classical Liberal Caucus, for those who don't know the acronym. And I was getting pretty incensed because I was frustrated with the enlightened centrism on display by some of the people involved. But it was in regards to Just Stop Oil and their protests. There was one that recently just came up in the news I don't know exactly what was done, but it was Just Stop Oil protest at Charles Darwin's grave. Um, I don't remember what was done to it. I don't think anything significant, because they don't ever damage anything that they actually protest at. Like that's one of the things that they appear to damage things, and they get people in like a riot, and then you find out later on that nothing ever gets damaged. Like they were getting famous for throwing soup on the Mona Lisa, but it was actually just protected by a glass panel, and no soup ever touched the actual painting. Um, they spray painted Stonehenge, and that got people upset. But it was actually just orange colored cornstarch, and it just washed right off. Like it doesn't actually do any damage to the rock. So they're famous for appearing to damage like cultural landmarks, and then not actually doing any damage to them. But there was a big discussion about the fact that the the people I was talking with didn't think that their protests were significant at all, and they didn't think that they were worth doing because Just Stop Oil doesn't have any ascribed motivations for what to do after we stop oil. Um, they only want the construction of new oil processing facilities to stop, and then a rapid scale down of existing oil facilities. And that's their whole thing. They're a single issue caucus or organization group and everything like that. They don't prescribe how to get energy. So a lot of people are calling them degrowthers, which isn't necessarily true because they haven't had taken a stance on whether they're pro nuclear or pro renewables, or they actually are degrowthers and they just want the energy production to stop with no replacement for it. They haven't taken a stance on that as an organization. It's purely just we want to stop oil. And so yeah, I mean, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that just from that description, but yeah.
Yeah. I it is hard for me to think of I mean, just statistically and empirically, a worse way to try and get people on your side. I understand grabbing attention, but then by like the appearance of attacking these pieces of art, or Stonehenge or something like that. I don't know. I know that they have ripped up a painting before. I don't know which one it was. And maybe it was a copy, or there's something else I don't actually know
It was
about it.
probably a copy or something. Like they're famous for appearing to destroy cultural objects without actually doing anything.
Right.
Which like on the one hand, I agree with you that that's a bad form of gaining attention, but on the other hand, it gains attention, and they're doing what they do on a shoestring budget of basically nothing. Like they only have what they have is only coming in through donations. They don't have a billionaire funding them or anything like that. And when you're competing against like Elon Musk or the Koch brothers or something like that, who have a vested interest in putting out as much disinformation as possible, mocking climate change.
Yeah.
You have to get inventive to get people's attention. I mean, if you just go out in Times Square or whatever and you put out a PowerPoint of climate change slides or whatever, nobody's going to pay attention at all.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's the LPNH strategy, right? Like say something you don't believe in that grabs attention, and now at least people are talking about your cause. I don't like it. I do understand the idea behind it. There's this book that I recommend often called Blueprint for Revolution. It is about how to get eyes on a protest. We actually used a lot of those when we fought with the police here in Ogden, Utah, and remarkably successful book. We didn't get arrested. They let us take care of the homeless. We still have, it's now legal to donate to them. Like when we were going against our council's, our city council, made it illegal. They have reversed that course. So I think, and this shades me, obviously, right? Like I have a bias just because I have that experience, right? Like I read this book, I implement what it says to do. We get some eyes on us in the newspaper, and local, programming, and then we have some success. So I agree that it's not to actually use LPNH in a bad example. I remember when the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, they went on Andrew Heaton's podcast, The Political Orphanage. Great podcast. If you're at all interested in like comedy side of like libertarian discussions, Andrew Heaton is probably one of like my top 10 libertarians, like of the current day. I love him. He's just funny. You may have even seen videos of him from like Reason. He does like comedy sketches for him. But he interviewed with them and talked about how the National Defend the Guard actually got struck down in New Hampshire and directly cited because of LPNH's bad behavior. Because they were like, are these the people that were like happy holidays with the John McCain and Meghan McCain crying over her father? And the governor was like, yeah, I'm not going to do anything that they touch, right? And LPNH's big, like, how do we come back from this? Is like, we're going to make the governor watch a video about what's happening like overseas, and then he'll like change course. Of course, that never happened. These are, making people, like you mentioned, infographics, like, spamming people with information and slides is not grabbing attention, right? It's important to grab attention. Thing is, there's really good and really bad ways to grab attention. I hope that Just Stop Oil changes course. There are effective shoestring budget ways to grab attention in a positive way. Now, a lot of this, I can't tell them exactly like what to do. I know what worked in my area, but that's part of these successful revolutions, is they kind of understand the demographics that are at play, what sways people's minds. I would just hope that they revert, that they change course. I think their hearts are in the right place. I think when you're pretending destroy historical objects and paintings, and getting all the credit for destroying them, by the way, that's what the media wants you to do, right? Like they will highlight you in this way every time. It is effective at generating
the news, like
attention.
they release information implying, and I think not necessarily implying in any like a intended to be duplicitous way, but like I think the news like rushes out to say, Stonehenge was defaced, or whatever, and they actually think it's true before they find out later on, and they issue a retraction saying, "Oh no, it was just cornstarch. It just washed right off." Like they do that over and over again, and a lot of people come to the conclusion that Stonehenge was actually like permanently defaced, and they never read the retraction. But on the other hand, how do you get attention like that on a large enough scale to get people's attention, and you don't do something that's that eye grabbing? Like I get the idea that you shouldn't get attention off a negative eye catch, but how do you compete with billionaire dollars? Like, I just don't know how you do it.
Yeah, there is good behavior ways to do it. I would encourage them to, the easiest ways that are what they're doing now, right? Like what's the easiest way to get everybody's attention on a subway? Crap your pants. Immediately people will get your like that gets people's attention. You can also sing a song, right? Like on a subway, and that will grab everybody's attention, but it'll be more for a positive way than a negative way. There are like great ways to go about this. They're rare because they require a lot more thought, right? Like it's so easy to block traffic. It is so easy to walk into a museum, pay your $20 to get past the front gate, hide a can of soup in your jacket and splash it on a painting, right? And then glue your hand to a wall. These are easy ways to do it. I think the problem is when this happens, it makes it difficult to side with them. We've talked about this before, like on other programs. I was like a climate denier for a century, a climate change denier for centuries. I mean, not literal centuries. I'm
Yeah,
not that
yeah,
old, but I mean, well over a decade, right? Like,
yeah.
and simply because the bad behavior of the climate change community, their bad predictions, and the very minimal pushback that they got. And when they would fudge a science, they would fudge some science, and the retractions were so quiet, right? Like when but their prediction of the end of the world was big, but the retraction was very quiet, and
Yeah, I gotta
I was
offer
just like,
a little bit of pushback to that. Little
sure,
bit. A little
yeah,
bit. Basically, I think that the scientists have generally been pretty measured in
mm-hmm.
their analysis. Like the scientists themselves very rarely will go out and say the polar ice caps will melt in 10 years. We have to act now or everything's doomed. You know, but
Right.
they'll release a report that can be twisted by the media to say something to that effect, like that the polar ice caps are 10 years away from utter destruction and we have to do something now or else everything is doomed. And then a decade later, it doesn't happen. And everybody's like, LOL, science is dumb.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a media issue and this is a politician issue,
Of course.
spinning scientific data into a political lens. Like Al Gore, for instance, Al Gore might actually have been relatively well meaning, but he absolutely used the climate crisis to his political advantage. And he said ridiculous things because he's a politician and he wants to get elected. And he
Yeah.
set the movement back quite a bit. But that doesn't mean that science is bad. That just
Correct.
means the science. I feel like scientists have actually been pretty measured in their analysis, and they're getting now to the point where they're like, okay, yeah, this is super serious. We have to take care of this, or we're screwed. Um, and that's particularly unusual because they don't usually say things like that. The last time they said something like that was like, "Hey, the ozone layer is getting pretty bad. We need to do something about it quick." And then the whole rest of the world was like, "Oh, yeah, let's take care of that." And then they did the things that they need to be done to take care of the ozone layer. And now we don't have an ozone layer problem anymore. And we have conservatives who are like, LOL, remember when they talked about the ozone layer and nothing
Right.
happened?
Right.
Because
Right.
we fixed it and now there's not a problem. And so they use it as an example of how scientists were, whining about the ozone layer and now nothing happened.
Yeah. To
It's
be
frustrating.
clear, I actually think science. So I remember the it's not the hockey stick chart, but it's the other scandal that they had, the leaked
Yeah.
emails.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember that was a big turning point for me because I remember like I wanted to look into it, and of course the quotes are bad, right? Like there's they'll say, "Hey, I know something like I know you want to see temperatures increasing, but we're just not seeing that," right? Like, and you just go like, "Oh crap," right? And then the guy will respond in the email, "Okay, how do we make it look like then it's like what data do we use then to show that it is increasing or whatever?" The thing is when you looked at those expanded emails, you could tell that the scientists all believed it was existing. Like they all believed in this, climate change, in this global warming that was occurring. This was just a snippet of, and I think when you say to the media, it's not just the media because, okay, so if you exist in science and you exist on grants, you get grant money if you're producing things, right? If you're creating things. And of course, almost all of these that are allowed to legally study it, most of them are government entities, which sucks, but that's where we're at. There are reasons that people who promote the free market tend to be suspicious about science's collusion with the free market. I'm a bit more skeptical about their collusion with government, but regardless, I understand like why that exists. The thing is that if you're going to get that big grant to keep doing the research you're doing, you have to produce something. And if you produce something splashy, something that's really flashy on the front of the page, even if it's a scientific study that just says something. Listen, if it says we're looking at a 15% decrease in water saturation per salt molecule, people are going to be like, I don't like that means nothing to me. And they're like, okay, what's another way to say that? icebergs getting dislodged because this higher salt volume or something like that is going to, you know what I mean, and creating more a propensity of tidal waves,
a narrative,
right? And
creating a
so
narrative.
and so the science, I don't want to say the scientists, but certainly the labs will like put together something that will be like, this sounds flashier, right? And then this gets you on Time magazine, and this gets you on the New York Times, and so on,
and
and
gets
so
you
forth.
news interviews and stuff like that. Yeah.
But to bolster your point, I actually have remember this article when people left An Inconvenient Truth, and there was some science change, the climate change guys, and the scientists were like, hey, just so you know, you got some information here that isn't right. And they gave him like a list of things that he had to like change, like just straight up false information that he had, as well as predictions that he was making that weren't true, right? That they hadn't predicted, right? And they're like, I don't know if I'd say these things. And Al Gore just ran with them anyway. He was like, oh, thank you so much for this feedback. Go F yourselves, right? Like, this is what I'm doing here. So politicians plays a role in this, media play a role in this, how we finance science plays a role in this, which is certainly something we need to talk about.
It's like you either get funding from the government, and I be perfectly honest, I have a lot as an anarchist, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but bear with me.
Yeah,
I have more faith in people that are funded by the government right now than I do with people that are funded by like fossil fuel companies.
Oh yeah,
like a fossil fuel company, you have a direct, like, tangible incentive to fake evidence to disprove climate change. Whereas the government, I mean, like, individual politicians might support climate change incentives, but the government as a whole is bureaucratic and politically neutral to the extent to which politically neutral means anything anymore. Sure. You know, like, like they're not incentivized to fake evidence for climate change, which is a ridiculous lie told by a lot of people.
I mean, there are politicians who have and do, and so,
yes,
I mean,
politicians that do, but like, I'm talking about like the institutions, the alphabet soup agencies and stuff like that fund climate science and everything. Like, they're not incentivized to fake climate science. Do you agree or not?
No, I would say they definitely have incentives to do it. And this is kind of like part of the problem. And I think this is why, I mean, we've seen them lie about everything under the sun, right? Like, I mean, does a laptop exist, right? I mean, these guys are really not trustworthy people, right? And so, like, and if it creates a narrative that gives them more power, just generally speaking, I think that this is something that they're going to,
I guess, power to me is nebulous, because, like, how much power do you get out of saying that climate change is real and providing evidence for it, versus how much power you get if you say the reverse? Like, there's benefits to the government in both scenarios as far as increasing their power. So it seems like a power neutral statement. Like, if your power comes from granting giving corporate subsidies to oil and gas industry, and then you get kickbacks for it, that's a form of power.
Of course.
And then you could also say that, like, causing oil and gas companies to lose their subsidies and, like, transferring those subsidies to, like, nuclear energy, that's also a form of power. But it's not in that second instance, where you're not getting kickbacks from the nuclear industry as much. Like, it's not as, that form of power is much more tenuous, I guess, is the what I'm trying to get at.
Well, and this is why you don't promote, nuclear power. This is why politicians will say, hey, listen, we're cutting back on, great example, what they did, the like Paris Accords, right? Big business was a big fan of that, because what it was is like, hey, we're not going to add anything more. Well, that's perfect. They don't want competition, right? Like, so all these smaller companies, right, going out of business. Oh, Walmart's still able to, oh, you guys can still expand. You guys can still have your land, everything like that. When the Cuyahoga River caught fire and it was a big, like, environmental disaster, that steel plant that did that is still polluting that river today. right? Like all they have to do is pay a license fee that
Right.
nobody except the big business can afford, right? Like, so they just monopolize themselves. So by creating this climate change, issue, and I guess I won't say creating, I know it exists, but say by harping on this climate change issue, you get to still keep your institutionalized big businesses and help monopolize them, get kickbacks from them, as well as fund pet projects. AOC talked about this a little bit, that ended up going absolutely nowhere, and most of it ended up in the pockets of people who had the same last names of the politicians in that district, right? Like you say, like, oh, we're going to fund like green sewers, right? Like we're going to do hydropower over here. Oh, what became of it? Oh, well, the district that it was written in the bill doesn't even really exist, right? Like, the money got sent, but I don't know where it is now. Oh, this funding just, we lost it, it's gone, right? Or it went to something, but like that thing that it went to, all you had to do is say, we're going to spend, say, $500 million, right? I mean, good example, $500 million on a gender studies program. Okay, that's great. I hope we're actually doing the gender studies program, right? No, I mean, it went to a teacher, and the teacher like made a few social media posts about it. And I guess that was the price of our $500 million. Yay. Like that is, and so politicians are really good at playing both sides of this, and any disaster that they can have is fantastic for them. Right. And so this is why, like, it's just, they need to be out of it. I completely agree that, so like, it's like, the misinformation from like the tobacco lobbyists, right? Like, of course it would be stupid to trust the tobacco lobbyists, right? Did government end up doing like some of the right things? Certainly. But we got to remember, who are the people opposing the tobacco lobbyists? Oh, it was big medicine, right? Like, and so they ended up, by being like, hey, you ban these guys, we're going to get them hooked on all this stuff over here. We're actually like, it's just a transfer of whoever had more power. They didn't ban, in fact, Joe Biden right now, I don't know if you've seen this, to ban cigarettes right now. They're not doing this because it's like out of the goodness of their hearts, right? They're doing this because this is what consolidation of power looks like, right? Like we get more people on these drugs over here, less people on these drugs over here. And it's all about who's forking over the most money for your campaigns, right? Like, or it's not, campaigns is even kind. I mean, they just fund projects. We look at Open Secrets, and those are the disclosed funds. And it's astronomical, millions of dollars per politicians just on what they spend trying to persuade them to their side. That doesn't include all the things that we have off of the record. And
I was gonna say that like the politician that had so many gold bars like stuffed in the walls of his house or whatever. Do you remember this story?
No.
From like 6 months ago?
No.
It was like a state senator or something like that, and he was so ridiculously corrupt that he had literal gold bars that he had like ensconced in his wall to hide them all from corruption that he'd like. Yeah, that's it.
Oh my gosh. Allegedly had a stash of, oh, this is too good.
Bob Menendez, that was his name.
Yeah,
I couldn't remember the name of the guy. Yeah,
it's actually a booming trend. Because of the surge in gold. Oh, fantastic. Right. And like none of that was like traced, right? Like all this is just stuff that
off
happens,
the books.
that off the books. We find out about it later, and it's absolutely ridiculous.
And it's like the guy only got caught because he was absurd. Like he was so lavishly corrupt that he ended up getting caught. But like the people who, like Nancy Pelosi, for instance, we know damn well she's insider trading like crazy. Sure. Like so many people have made it's such a meme that like people follow her stock portfolio, and then they do the same thing as her because they know that she's insider trading, so they can take advantage of her decisions. Yeah. Like it's, but we can't catch them on it because they're savvy enough to do it in a way that doesn't like trace it to them.
Yeah, it's still the top.
We know that she's doing it, but we can't prove it. So then, therefore, we just like look the other way and pretend it doesn't exist.
Or we can prove it. A big one that got me was that I I did not know the ethics committee kept a file on like everybody and just didn't release it until like they had
Oh,
to slash wanted to.
for
And
the
I'm
Matt
just like,
Gaetz
so
situation.
you, yeah, like with Matt Gaetz, right? Is when this comes to light for me. I had
Yeah,
no idea they knew he's like soliciting sex from minors and have texts and like financial records and everything. And I'm just like, when were you planning on releasing this? It took him like getting selected for this like cabinet position. Why didn't we know about this as soon as it happens? Like what the ethics committee is just literally sitting on this. And then the big threat was, and what's sad is I want to take her up on it, but Marjorie Taylor Greene's like,
yeah,
why don't we release it for everybody? And I'm like, yeah, why
yeah,
don't we? This is
yeah.
absurd.
It's like the one good idea she's ever had in her entire
I,
life.
right. And I know that like her intent was we shouldn't do this because then we should do it for everybody. But it's the whole your terms are acceptable meme, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
please,
Well, I mean,
please.
I think in her mind, I legitimately think in her mind, they would release it, and it would reveal all the Democrats that are doing all the terrible things, and then there wouldn't hardly be any Republican corruption at all, because in her mind, Republicans are godly, saintly angels. Um, and she'd be in for a rude awakening, I think. But
I think so. Yeah.
yeah,
I think so. Since we're on the topic of misinformation, that actually was something I wanted to share with you, and it ties into the conversation we were going to have about diversity anyway.
Mhm.
I don't know which order I want. I guess I'll start on the misinformation part. We are in a unique age where we have access to unbelievable amounts of information, and we are kind of just willfully aware, like we are making decisions to believe things that aren't true. And we've talked about this before, Aaron, here, where I just said it was when JD Vance got up and was like, well, if I have to spin a tale to save America, so be it. Right. Like, and I'm just like, how do people not like immediately, like, to me, that's like immediate discreditation. And I will tell you this, like, coming from the right wing, one of my big moments, I think I've shared this story with you before too, was when protesters blocked a street and an ambulance got caught in the block and the person on the ambulance died. And that was from InfoWars. That was Alex Jones. I didn't know really Alex Jones at the time, but I was in the right. I'm sure that's why I saw the InfoWars article, is because I was going through my right-wing sources and that came up. And I remember sharing it. And I remember people being like, this story, like, it just isn't true. Like, people are trying to track down the ambulance, and, that they looked at the death records on the day. Like, this is just a straight up fictional story. And I remember just being like, I am never using InfoWars again. I'm never using Alex Jones again, right? Like, as right wing as I wasn't right wing because I was like, I mean, I guess there was some enjoyable parts of it, but it wasn't, I thought it was right, I guess is what I'll say. Like, I thought it was true. And we've kind of hit this stage where people don't care if it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this is an exclusively right-wing problem, although they are often the most aggressive about it on Facebook and Twitter, certainly. But like, it's definitely a human problem that we're having, where people see information and then just kind of file it away and just say like, but it still helps my side. It's like an internal ends justify the means kind of thing. Like, this lie furthers like a good thing. And this is like a remarkably unchristian thing. God is not an ends justify the means guy. One of the takeaways that I had from the Bible reading this week is how the people who are cast aside, whether it's Hagar or Ishmael or Esau, or earlier we had Cain, some of these people even deserve to get set aside, don't get me wrong, but God still cares about them, right? Leah, another one, right? Like, God loves them and cares about them and converses with them and talks with them. These aren't secondary characters in God's story, right? Like, and as far as human religion goes, when we construct Judaism or Christianity, these people become secondary characters when we're teaching our kids these stories. But in God's eyes, these people are main characters every bit as much as the rest of them, and so when we dismiss people's stories in order to create, and I'll be specific about this one, since I'm talking about is people blaming DEI and talking about how this is what caused the wildfires in California. It was this diversity, equity, and inclusion. That there's so many lies in all these things. There's videos of like Black people getting out of their house and bringing their TVs and Xboxes and all their expensive gadgets. Those are literally their homes. And these videos were spread about because it was like, whoop, look which people are taking advantage of the looting. I know I'm not supposed to talk about, look who's looting. And they're literally just leaving. Like, these are people trying to leave their homes. And when they're confronted with that, just like when JD Vance like finally had to confront the fact that the Springfield thing was not happening, they just go, well, maybe it's not true this time, but you know,
the general trajectory is true, and therefore the details don't matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, take it away from me, Aaron. But what, like, I guess I'm kind of exhausted. Like, I love the truth, and like the truth guides so much of what I do. Even when I was kind of, and I think it's hard for me to understand because even when I was a bad person, like even when I was like a homophobic Christian, when I contended with these verses in the Bible that I tried to make them say what they didn't say, I at least had a line where I was like, okay, I'm not going to pretend that line is homophobic anymore now that I know what it says, right? Like there was a point where I was like, I've interpreted the verse, I've read the language, I've done the anthropology, I'm aware this is not a homophobic verse. I can't pretend anymore. I'm still anti-gay because of other verses or, you know, something like that, but I'm not going to use this piece of bad information anymore. But we are choosing to use bad pieces of information, and it's kind of scary how many people are in on it, including like fellow friends of yours and mine that kind of get in on it. And I think it's become a mainstream thing to kind of choose your information and pick the bits that you like. But yeah, I talked for a long time, but
no, I mean, like, I think you're right in your assessment that the majority of misinformation comes from the right, but there's a sizable amount of it that comes from the left too. I mean, it is worrisome the amount of people who will say, and this is also comes from the right, but this is more of a left issue, that'll say anti-Zionism when they're actually just being anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And like I say anti-Zionism because I mean anti-Zionism, and then I'll team up with somebody else on the left and they'll say anti-Zionism, and it's very clear they don't mean anti-Zionism. They just like dislike Jews at this point, which I sympathize with getting so frustrated with the Hamas situation that you go further than what you should be doing. Like I get how you would come to that conclusion, but it's not the way to go. Like, I mean, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here that neither one of us are anti-Semitic, and we wouldn't do that. But it's frustrating to have allies that you legitimately believed in go that route, and you're just like, where did you go, man? Like you were on my side, and now I have to disavow you at this point. I've cut a lot of people off that I liked. Like I've had Jewish friends of mine cut me off because they're so pro-Zionist that they refuse to engage with my content anymore because they're just like, you hate Jews. And I'm like, no, man, I don't. I absolutely don't. But I'm not going to abide by evil. And what Israel is doing is evil. But yeah. I've also had to cut off left-wing friends because they've actually gone from that. They've crossed that barrier from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, and I'm like, I'm not going to follow you there either. So
it's not like you say follow you there. It's not like it's a slope. It's not like the two are connected. I mean, how much time do we spend talking about Christians, right? Like, and being like, I love Christianity, but Christians in general need some fixing, but I don't hate them, right?
I got you. No. They're not connected, but there's a whole lot of Zionist propaganda connecting the two. Like, that's the thing that weds them together in a way that's unnatural. But like so much IDF propaganda says that Zionism and Judaism are the exact same thing. Like if you speak out against one, you're speaking out against the other. with what's her name? The Ilhan Omar. Like
Oh yeah.
she's
Okay.
talked about the evils that Israel engages in, and she's been accused of anti-Semitism so many times. And I've looked into her statements, and it's a possibility that I've missed something, but I have never seen anything that she said that I could come across as anti-Semitic. Um, she's just talked about the how her heart is so hurt by what's happening in Palestine,
Right.
and she's an effective orator, so she gets called anti-Semitic. Because that's what they do. Is like the Zionists, they'll call anyone that's anti-Zionist anti-Semitic because it's politically efficacious to do that. It sucks.
You and I are talking about similar friends for some
Yeah.
of these, and it's unfortunate because I think I've seen. Thankfully, you end up taking the brunt of this most of the time. I feel like I talk about it somewhat often, but I a post every couple of weeks, I guess, doesn't make the effectiveness that you have. But yeah, like just seeing like friends that you've had strong relationships with just be like, oh, you're you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. I can't believe you would say this. And just
I've
that friendship is gone in an instant. You're
Yeah.
just like,
I'm
this
not
is
going to put him on blast on this pod, on this call
I
or
think I know
anything
who
like
we're
that.
talking about, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I worked with him on the Vermin Supreme campaign for
Yeah.
years. Very, very close friend of mine. Well, a very close acquaintance of mine. I'm not going to say friend, but we were close. And he just cut me off completely. Like
Yeah.
he's blocked me for over a year now. I still see him because he gets tagged in other posts that are made in mutual groups that we're in.
Sure.
But he's a ghost to me now because he's so Zionist that he can't engage with anything that doesn't reflect his position, regardless of, as we were talking about, whether it's true or not. And
Yeah.
like if you try to pursue truth, you're gonna get pissed off. You're gonna piss off a lot of people that don't care about truth. They care about dogma. And yeah.
You look at Stop Anti-Semitism, I think is it .org.com, one of those two. Stop
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism dot something.
Yeah.
And
.com, I think.
they've gone so far off the rails. I mean, just this person wore a burqa to her job or a hijab or something. And
Kafaya.
that
They get obsessed about
the
the kafaya.
kafaya, yeah. And I'm just like, this is cultural, like this is cultural garb. This isn't even, some of it's not even religious garb, right? Like, and you are being anti-Islam now, right?
Yes.
Like, what
Yes.
are you doing?
They're
Like,
so ridiculously anti-Islam. It's ridiculous.
it's and this is and like this is the problem is when you have a good message, like something like I followed these people before October 7th, I guess. I don't know when they went off the
Yeah.
rails, but I don't like anti-Semitism, and they were the leaders of it, right? And so the problem is when you have these people fall into this trap, and their explanation for it is like, whenever you do bring up this anti-Zionism thing, I've seen them explain this before. They're like, well, 90% of the Jews in the world are Zionists. So by you being anti-Zionist, you're anti-Jew, like anti 90% of the Jews. Well, okay, 90% of Christians regard homosexuality as a sin, right? Like, I think they're very wrong about that. I think it's bigoted. I think it's homophobic, right? Like, I have issues with that. I am a Christian. I'm not anti-Christian, right? Like,
Yeah.
I have a problem with an ideology that many of them pick up. And but I mean, they're all individuals. There are many Jews in Israel, in fact, a higher percentage of them than some of that are anti-Zionist, right? Like a higher percentage than some of the rest of the world, And it's the sad part is there's a need for people to call out anti-Semitism. I mean, the fact that you can go, there was this experiment where these people would wave a flag, right? This one person's waving this, Israeli flag, and like what happened to them on the college campuses. I think they did this at Berkeley. I don't want to shame somebody who wasn't responsible for it or whatever, but just like, violence, spitting, stuff thrown at them, right? And then versus if they waved like, a flag of Palestine, right? And it's like, man, like you really should not. And you know, then they're getting high fives and laughs and you know, cheers and everything like that. And I'm not saying that I think that people should be able to weigh both. And I think even if one's like a bad idea, I love Judaism. I don't really like what Israel is doing. I wouldn't threaten violence against somebody waving an Israel flag any more than I would somebody waving a Palestinian flag. I mean, the issues that I can talk about, the issues Palestine has right now, and right, like
Well, I
that's
mean, the
you know,
frustrating
but
thing is even then you wait the fact that their flag is literally the Star of David
yeah,
makes the state of Israel and Judaism, the religion, intertwined in a way that's really toxic.
yeah,
You know, because if you're carrying around a flag of Israel, you're not promoting Judaism. It'd be like if you're carrying around like a bust of Christopher Columbus. Like you're gonna get people shitting on you because you're actively promoting a colonizing imperialist.
right,
And same thing with, I mean, people see that flag of Israel and they think the same thing. You know, you're promoting a fascist state.
right. And if
And
Christopher Columbus is wearing a cross necklace, that doesn't make him less problematic, right? It's not all
yeah,
of a sudden like, oh, you hate the cross around his neck. It's like, no, no. If anything, I'm even more upset with him that he's hiding behind that cross. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I am upset with Israel for hiding behind that Star of David, right?
yeah,
Like, it is not,
exactly.
that is not right what they are doing. Yeah, you know, since it's on the subject and we're talking about it, I will bring this in here just before. Oh, I cut you out. That was bad of me. Here we go. Just before we go on to talk about diversity, right? Um, that, you know, we have a ceasefire arranged apparently today. We're still getting the details of it. Um, I have an earlier version that was agreed to, or that was not agreed to, but there's been changes. I don't know what those changes are. At the moment, I'm not sure anybody else does. I keep like refreshing it and checking.
Yeah,
I am curious because both Biden and Trump have claimed that they did it. It's very possible that neither one did it. Um, I really don't know. Now, some of the misinformation about this, and Aaron, you're probably aware of this, we haven't been waiting for Hamas to agree to the
yeah,
peace. We've
yeah,
been waiting for Israel. So one of the issues I had is, well, oh, Trump is responsible for this because Hamas is peeing themselves because they're worried that he's going to blow them up as he threatened to do so, you know, like after if the hostages aren't released. Well, there's two issues with that. One is, by all accounts that I've seen so far, like I said, I haven't seen all the details yet, but only 33 of the 250 hostages are being released. I think they're releasing like infants and people over 50 or something like that. So they're still keeping hostages. That much is still going on. Hamas is keeping the hostages. And so that's, you know, and Trump threatened to, what he said, if the hostages aren't released by my inauguration day, there's going to be hell or hell to
yeah,
pay, something like that or whatever. But we haven't been waiting on Hamas. Hamas has agreed to essentially this deal, and the reason I bring up this article is it mentions that this same ceasefire agreement has been around since May 2024. It's Israel that has finally come to the table and has agreed to sign this thing.
mhm,
Now, this article, I think, from Reason is a good one because it kind of goes into first of all, there's like a million links here, which I love. I love when there's like lots of links to click, that way you can see if it's true or not.
yeah,
But, you know, President Biden promoting this de-escalation through escalation strategy, and what an absolute disaster that has been. What a
mhm,
surprise. More war doesn't create less war. That shouldn't surprise anybody, but there you have it. Um, the death count, where am I here? 46,600 people. Cost of rebuilding $500 billion. And that was back in May 2024, right? And also that 46,600 number may have missed 40% of deaths, violent deaths, not
yeah,
just, and then and also doesn't include deaths due to starvation and disease, which we know have been happening. I mean, you see these bodies and how emaciated they are.
right.
this is, I am happy that we are getting some kind of ceasefire. I don't know the details. I will say of if it is the agreement that is currently going around that they say has been adjusted a little bit, it's not good. Not only is Hamas still keeping most of these hostages to be negotiated with in 16 days, they're still keeping most of them, but also Israel is allowed to occupy Gaza still, and Hamas, unlike what Israel wanted, Hamas is going to remain in power in Palestine. And so this is, if you wonder why there keep being issues through the Middle East, this is
It's
systemic. I mean, this is an agreement.
This
None
is
of
not
this
getting
works.
rid of. It's not getting rid of any of the systemic issues.
Right.
Like on Israel's side, Hamas should be disposed,
Yeah.
deposed of. PLO should be put in power in Gaza, and once the country can get back on its feet, maybe like 2 years or something like that. Obviously, get back on its feet, relative speaking, because it's probably going to take decades, as the article says.
Yeah.
But like in 2 years or something like that, under PLO control, there should be another election, and the Gazan people should decide what to do from that point on. But I don't think that anybody could disagree that the PLO is probably the best organization to run Gaza for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And that should be the Israeli concession, is that Hamas is destroyed as an institution.
Yeah.
And then on the Palestinian side, there's so much that needs to be done, like massive, massive reconstruction effort from the entire world, but specifically Israel should be funding a reconstruction effort. And there must be some sort of actual guarantee with collateral of some sort. I don't know what the collateral would be, that Israel can't just reinvade again in 3 months or whatever.
Right. Otherwise, it's just Russia, right? Like they're just
exactly.
They dip
It's
their
just
toes
like
in every so often.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing with Russia that really gets me is like they specifically gave away their nukes under the promises that they wouldn't be invaded again.
So
and that
Ukraine.
we would, yeah, I'm talking about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Gave away their nukes, the Budapest Memorandum, and so that they would be protected by the United Nations, and Russia, and ended up getting protected by no one, essentially. Like we've sent them weapons, but we haven't actually actually protected them. And Russia's literally part of that agreement, and they're the ones that attacked them, And so that we can't end up having a situation like that with Israel inventing some sort of pretext to invade Palestine again and continue to occupy them and everything like that. But none of that's going to happen. In reality, what you said earlier is almost certainly what's going to happen. Israel is going to continue to maintain their stranglehold, and they're going to continue to do what they've been doing, which is letting just enough aid in that most people don't starve to death. But most people don't starve to death still means that you're having, 500 people a day die of starvation. And the idea is just to make life just barely not insufferable enough to either kill yourself or flee to another country, and otherwise just make everything miserable as possible, so that eventually you can claim that land, because it's all about land. It's that's all what it is. It's just a land grab. They want Gaza so they can have beachfront properties.
You look at with what they've been doing, they clearly need each other to survive. It's not a surprise that of all these agreements that we keep having with them, Hamas stays around, the IDF stays around, right? Like Netanyahu he's unpopular. He needs a Hamas to exist. Otherwise, people just say because people will tolerate. I mean, look at we as Americans. We will tolerate imbecilic behavior so long as we think it's the lesser evil, right? And so they say, well, yeah, Netanyahu sucks. He's a liar. He's bad. He's war criminal, all that. But the alternative is Hamas, invades and kills us all. And what does Hamas do? The people in Palestine, Hamas is evil, terrorists, take our rights away, not popular, but it's better than Israel, committing genocide against us.
Yeah, man, and so if I was going to have some sort of ideal peace agreement, it
Uh-huh.
would be replacing Hamas with the PLO and replacing the Likud government with some sort of moderate Israeli politician. I don't know who it would be, but like just appointing that person to be the
Yep.
prime minister for, however long their term of service is, 2 years or whatever, 4 years, however long it is,
Yeah.
and letting them have an election in, the next cycle or whatever, but saying this cycle you've lost your right to have a fascist warmonger as your president or your prime minister. Like it's not acceptable. But
Yeah.
that would never happen. Like there's no way in hell both Biden and Trump are like definitely not going to do that. So
Yeah. I mean,
that's not going to
yeah.
happen.
I mean, you look at the US's involvement in this, right? Like we spent $22 billion only on arming Israel to attack Iran. Just that element, right? And that's not even the main war we're talking about, right? We're talking about
Yeah.
the other side of this. So it's funny because we talk about rebuilding it. I say $50 billion like it's a big feat. We spend that on Israel all the time, right? Like that's a drop in the bucket, right? Like that to us is nothing. We spent like we could rebuild this in a day. I mean, it would obviously take time, but you know what I mean. We could write the check that solves the problem in a day, but we're not interested in that. We're deploying actual troops to Israeli soil. We're sending them. It was down here lower, but yeah, $22 billion to attack. Here we go, to attack Iran. The U.S. troops are still deployed. We still got interests in Yemen. That stems from when Trump was aiding a genocide there. I mean, this is all a mess. And unfortunately, all the people at that, Aaron, what you mentioned seems reasonable to everybody. The people at the negotiating table are the people you least want at that negotiating table. If you took maybe like jury selection, right? Like 12 random Israeli people and 12 random Palestinians, they would come up with a solution better than this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a disaster. I'm thankful for a ceasefire. Bar none, obviously, with the level at which Israel is committing a genocide. I am happy that the bombs will at least stop falling. But the implementation of what's in place here, and the fact that Israel could have agreed to this at any time and has only agreed to it now, that like popularity is kind of wearing thin for it after blowing up X amount of hospitals, X amount of publications, and
All
killing
of the
X amount of
hospitals.
journalists, right?
There
Like
is not a
all
single functioning hospital left in Gaza.
every hospital, huh?
Every single hospital has been either completely destroyed or partially destroyed.
Yikes.
On that note, we're more than an
Yeah.
hour in and we haven't talked about the Bible yet. And so as much as I'd love to talk
Yeah.
about that, like, Dad, we can put that off till next week.
Maybe. All right. Tell you what, let's talk Bible. And if we get a little time at the end,
yeah.
we'll throw the other stuff in there, because I didn't even get to my diversity thing that I wanted to get to. I love diversity. It's a big deal for me. All right. So you had some notes here when you're reading the Bible.
I knew if I didn't write them down, I was going to lose them in my head.
That's totally cool. I read them live, and so I have to kind of remember. I like reading them. At the same time, it does when I'm the one reading them live. It's like I just kind of have to keep going, right? And so it's not jot notes every so often, so it's nice.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess we'll kind of go note by note here. Some of these I feel are explicable when you kind of recognize. All right, so to explain to people, you had no notes for Matthew, which is or Psalms or Proverbs, which is kind of legitimate. They're very self-explanatory. Jesus is who we're all about here as the Love First Christians. I love Jesus, right? He's a very explicable guy. There were the cooler parts were with Jesus, but they require so little explanation, right? Like
right.
when he gives you these
it's Matthew specifically, and I feel like of all the Gospels, Matthew's the one that I've read the most.
Uh-huh.
So like I not that I have the least to learn, I shouldn't say that, but like I've covered it several times, so it's less new to me. Like there's not anything that's like, holy crap, I've never read this before, you know, as opposed to some of the things that like I was reading about Isaac and I was like, wait a minute, I don't remember this in Genesis at all, you
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about Abraham saying his wife is his sister, not once, but twice
Right.
over here. Um, so I will, Aaron, and I know you're asking the question, so I hate to turn it to you like quickly, but like I don't know how you resolve it, and maybe you just don't at this moment. One of the things that I learned when studying from the rabbi is a lot of the times when we're reading these Old Testament stories, we're not reading them correctly. We're reading of Abraham as a hero. We're reading of Isaac as a hero. We're reading of Jacob as a hero. And what we need to do is instead, one, accept that they are comparatively righteous people for what's going on in their region. Now, from a historical perspective, that makes a little bit of sense. A guy lying about who his wife is, when you look at the atrocities being committed like around the world at this age, it ranks a little bit lower, right? That being said, the point of the gospels is the way I've had the rabbi explain to me, I guess not gospel, but the point of this Torah is to show, and God will actually say this later on in the Old Testament, is to show them that they are bad people and that they are miserable people. And the reason for their success is because God chose them, not because they chose God. It's because God said, I'm going to make you, even though you're inbred and you are backwoods and you have no power and you are aggravating people, I am going to turn you into a kingdom that will build for my glory, right? Like I will show you that my faith can survive anywhere, because if it can survive with you, it can survive anywhere. If I make the faith survive with the Philistines or the Canaanites or the Egyptians, people would be like, well, sure, they were big empires, right? Like, of course their faith flourished. But I want my faith to flourish by selecting kind of the worst, smallest people. So a lot of times what we have is them being bad people, and that's the point of what we're reading, is that they are bad people. And in this case with Abraham, it's not a story. So anti-Semites will quote the story a lot because the idea of the Jewish trickster to get ahead in the world is kind of like something that people paint the Jews out to be. Like these are your heroes, and they're constantly manipulating people and tricking people, and this is the way of the Jews, is to trick people. The thing is on a rabbinical level, these stories are not taught to the Jews to say, yes, this is how you get ahead in the world. The story is taught to Jews to be like, wow, we really were a miserable people. Thank goodness God showed mercy upon us.
Hmm.
You know, and that is the explanation I have, especially when we talk about the story with Abraham and Abimelech, this king Abimelech, where he is pawning his wife off as his sister and receiving all the kickbacks of being like, oh, let me pay for your sister so she can be my wife. And he's taking those payments, right? Like it's a deceptive thing to do. It's a bad thing to do. And good on Abimelech for being like, what's wrong with you? You know, like
Yeah.
you know, and even then, Abimelech recognizes that God's on his side and lets Abraham keep the stuff that he achieved deceptively. I feel for Abimelech quite a bit on this one.
Well, yeah, it's like I feel for Abimelech, but also like later on when we get to it, Ladan got screwed so bad by Isaac, and well,
Oh,
or
Laban. Oh,
Laban,
yeah.
Laban, sorry,
Is
not
it pronounced Laban?
Laban. I don't know. I don't know how it's pronounced. I pronounced it Laban in my head, but yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah,
Yeah,
no,
go ahead.
yeah, as we're talking about Abimelech, like I didn't understand the scenario that because it's not just the fact that he does it, like he does it, and we end up getting in this, later, just in a couple chapters later, we get to the story of like Abraham being prepared to sacrifice Isaac
Mm.
and being told, no, now I know you're truly my son, my chosen follower and everything like that, and it makes him out to be a saint. And but like, wait a minute, Abraham was just screwing over people like a chapter ago. Like, is this the hero? You know, like it feels really wrong because, especially since every single like kid's Bible tells you only the good stories, you know, and you're like, wait a minute, Abraham's like a lot of real estate of the Bible is taken up telling us about terrible things that Abraham did. You know, like why is he the hero? Um, and it's part of what you're saying is that he's not the hero. You know, like
Yeah.
he's a flawed person, but I guess my real contention comes from the fact that in both this story and the story that we're going to talk about later with Laban or Laban or whatever his name is, God interferes with the people that have been taken advantage of getting any sort of restitution. And
Yeah.
that irks me.
But I'll cross the Laban Bridge when I get to it, because
Yeah.
I do have a little tweak that makes that story
I mean,
a little bit different than this one.
the fact that
But
they have a covenant at the end, that helps a lot. But
yeah.
yeah.
All right. Hagar emphasized over Ishmael, Abraham's son. Yeah, bad. I think it's so. When I first,
I wrote that because Ishmael is his. I say Ishmael is his son, and Hagar is a servant.
Yes.
Like Hagar is his wife's servant or something like that.
Yes.
And then Ishmael takes a shining to him, and the two of them. But the fact that like the Bible emphasizes that from Abraham's perspective, Hagar is the one that he's looking out for, not his own son, and that seemed like it was super weird. But that's the perspective that he took.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. I think. Okay, that's why I say Hagar emphasized over Ishmael.
Yeah.
I think Ishmael is still in his infancy in this one, if I were to have to guess. So, like, I think that Hagar is worried about what will become of her son, because she's, a little bit selfish. She's an adult; she can take care of herself, but doesn't know what will become of her son. And I think that's why God speaks to her instead of, well, eventually Ishmael, but at the moment, why he speaks to Hagar instead of Ishmael, because I don't think Ishmael at this point is at the stage of being like, what shall become of my kingdoms? I think he's just worried about what's for dinner, and so that's why I would guess that God speaks to Hagar. Another one you noted here, Genesis 22, it says only son Isaac. Specifically, it says only son whom I love, Isaac. So he doesn't love Ishmael. Again, really bad. God loves Ishmael. Abraham doesn't. And they're willing to cast him out.
I don't understand why God doesn't admonish Abraham for that perspective. I mean, like, how could you turn your back on your son like that? I mean, you've cast him out on spurious means. Like, he was cast out, if I remember correctly, because he was making fun of Isaac. Like, he was just like, he and Hagar were like making jokes at Isaac's expense, and Sarah was like, no, get rid of them. And like, so he like making jokes at somebody's expense. If I remember right, Isaac was like a toddler at the time anyway, so like he wouldn't have had any long-term memories about this or anything like that. But that's enough to get banished.
Sure. Like, obviously you guys are going to have this lifelong feud if we don't, or whatever. It's sad to think, and I talk about this sometimes, that there are verses in the Old Testament that we get. Jesus says, specifically with like divorce, for example, was like, you got that because your hearts were hard. And God can handle anything. You couldn't handle God's will. So you had to have a bad policy. Otherwise you just leave. Right? They're like, so I don't know what all is just like, they are bad. God does correct them sometimes, but like, generally speaking, he lets a lot go that we would not let go. And it's just not like, I think it's just not the way of people. And so God, like, the issue is if God like comes in with like the hardcore egalitarian truth, they're just going to turn their backs on God. And God's over here trying to make it work with them. like working with them as much as he can. And so he's
That's
like, fine,
that's
cast
gotta
them
be
out,
rough.
and I will take care of them. Like God is like, I'll take care of Ishmael because my love has no bounds. Your love is limited.
Yeah.
So, you know what? I agree Ishmael's probably better off without him. God probably lets the banishment happen because he's not like keep him around and learn to love him, because that guy's a douche, right? So he's just like, all right, I don't want you to live in this house where you're constantly thought of as a lesser person. I'm gonna give you your own kingdom where you are treated with the respect you deserve, you and your descendants, you know?
Yeah.
And that's my takeaway from it. Again, emphasizing the severe fallen nature of Abraham, but yeah, I mean, and humanity, but yeah.
Next thing I just wrote was Ishmael is back. In 25:9 when they're burying Abraham, um, like with no fanfare or whatever, it says, Abraham is being buried by Isaac and Ishmael. Um, and then he's gone again, effectively in the story. But he's briefly mentioned to come back. I guess he came back for his father's death,
Yeah.
which, awful magnanimous of him considering his way his father treated him.
Yeah, the love that he had for his father was greater than his father's love for him. Yeah. This obviously gets onto like the Quran and the Islam as a faith. Something that I think is worth looking into. I think that this is where we see that schism, right? And clearly God declares a blessing upon those people. And if you're ever wondering what those blessed people go on to do, yeah, it's Ishmael, right? Like it's Islam and that nation. And so I think there's validity there, right? Like like a lot of people are like, well, I don't see it as an Abrahamic religion. I understand why you might not, but they are. And this is clearly a tie into that. Now, the fact that they have a whole other holy scripture, maybe you can't jive with that, but I think more Christians would be better off doing it. A lot of Christians, I mean, we toss out the Talmud outright, and I get that there are a lot of problematic elements within the Talmud, but Jesus quotes the Talmud. This is a book that he was familiar with. This was a gospel to him. It is not a gospel to us today. And I think it's okay for us to kind of question like should we make it a gospel or not kind of thing. But it is, like it was. And I think that it's fair. I love, now, obviously, with my degree in theology, I love studying other religions. I opted to get the Bachelor of Science because in theology, as opposed to, divinity or, ministry or, anything that would have been Bachelor of Arts in like Christianity,
Sure.
right? I wanted to study the other ones. And I find that the tie-ins with the Quran and how it relates to the Old Testament to be quite valid. I, of course, recognize that Christ was more than just a prophet. And there are differences that I have. Obviously, I reject kosher law based on happenings in the New Testament, as well as my own personal convictions. So I'm not saying we swallow it all, but this is no different than what I feel about Judaism. And heck, how Christ felt about Judaism, where he's like, you've been told this, but I tell you this. Eye for an eye. It's in the Old Testament.
You got a lot of value out of reading Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of wisdom to be found in non-biblical religious texts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think perhaps legitimately divinely inspired. And I send it through the Bible too, because there's parts here where we say not divinely inspired, but more human inspired. We look at when they get the orders to execute all their all the people of a city when they take over, right? And then they approach God about that policy, and God's like, "That's a stupid policy." So I don't have any issue with what's the challenge we get with the tree, right? You take that fruit, and if it bears good fruit, or you take the seed, you plant it, you nurture it. If it bears good fruit, then it's from God, and if not, then it's not. And I think there's some verses in the Bible that if you take them out to their fullest extent or out of context, or as we're doing here, if you make Abraham out to be a hero and you're trying to defend what he's doing here, I think if you practice this, you will get some very bad fruits in your life. And other people will get bad fruits as well. But yeah.
I almost wrote down, that was the one thing in Matthew that I read that I almost wrote down, was that story about the bearing bad fruits.
Mhm.
Because I wonder, like, how much does that analogy hold when you're talking about people that are in bad phases of their life, or in particularly good phases as bad people? You know, like somebody might be
Yep.
magnanimous when they're have a whole bunch to spare, but in general they're a bad person. And alternatively, you know, somebody who's a good person might be in a phase of their life where they just so beaten down that they act out of character. Um,
Yeah. So they're specifically talking not just about like fruit as in rewards. They're talking about fruit of as in fruit of the spirit.
sure.
Um, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So this is why you can still see people with good fruit while they are in prison. Like all the apostles, these are good fruits. They get killed, but like the results of what they did resulted in more love, more. You even talk about like the joy that they have while they're in prison. They're singing hymns, right? The patience, the kindness they have towards their enemies, right? Like they are emphasizing all those fruits of the spirit. If you were to do what Abraham is doing here, you get like none of them. Now you ask how much it holds up. I'll be honest, that is one of the sections of the Bible back when Patty and I were doing these conversations. And Patty, if you're listening, I know you usually tend to listen to these things and we talk about them, but I hope you're well, and I hope to see you again soon. Um, but the but this is a verse that I take, like if I were to ask to take one of four verses of the Bible, this is one of them, because I think that this is how we teach truth to people in this age. Because I don't know. Okay, I'm a big interlinear Bible fan because I like seeing the origin of the words as much as I can. But there are new versions of the interlinear Bible like every year. We discover something new all the time. We discover older verses, and then we get new understanding about what this, that, or the other means, right? Like this is the reason why I don't just go with the King James version on everything. This is the reason why it's like, oh, it says laying with other men, right? And then I'm like, oh, is that the word? And it's like, oh no, this is actually the word, right? And so I go back and back and back. And I may not ever know the origin, right? Like the truest God's word of the Bible. But what I can do, and I can discover the fruits of the Spirit. Every person, even if they've never read the Bible, is capable of fulfilling this. If they look at their lives and they just say, I think about this all the time when we talk about the queer topic, that I just simply look at the fruits of the anti-queer people. And this is I know I recommend this book all the time, but I will do it once again, The Widening of God's Mercy. This is literally the thing that made them stop being anti-gay. They were like, well, we saw the fruits. What we said is we're going to be gay exclusionary. We love them, but we'll just say they can't be priests or can't be, we will welcome them into church, but we recognize what they're doing is a sin. And then they looked at their fruits 20 years after implementing their policy. And they were like, these are bad fruits that we're getting. And then as soon as they reverse this policy, better fruits. I would take it 100%. And maybe that's just me, but I have no problem drawing this out like to its full extent. I make almost all the gospel. Like I base a lot of the gospel's fruit and truth on this particular passage. My human understanding will fail me, but I feel like this verse has always led me in the right direction. I might not know, like I might have this debate with the anti-gay Christians forever. What is undebatable is the fruits that we produce. You know, I can talk about word origins and anthropology and everything, and we might both make good points. It'd be a stalemate. This is what breaks the stalemate. I don't know. I love it.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, going back to Genesis though, 2531 was it's a story of how Esau is coming back from a hunt. Like he's a hunter and he's starving. Like he's just like really, really, really hungry coming back to the camp. And Jacob's sitting there, and presumably for what I mean, like, he doesn't elaborate why, but Jacob has had the benefit of being in camp and is relaxing and everything like that. And his brother, who's been out hunting, providing for the family, comes back to camp and he's starving, and he sees that his brother has soup, and he's like, "Yeah, give me some of your soup." And Jacob's like, "Yeah, I'll give it to you on the condition you give me your birthright." So he's extorting his starving brother, who's been out hunting, for food. It's just so incredibly ridiculous. Like it's so egregiously hateful that it's hard to even like sympathize with him, even as a flawed human being. And
Yeah.
I it's hard to me to like wrap my head around, because I grew up on stories of like Jacob and the Technicolor Dreamcoat or whatever. And like Jacob is this stand up guy, and then I read this story, and then I read the stories that we're coming up to,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just like, where is that Jacob that I read as a kid? You know?
Genesis, I when I introduce people to the Bible, it's a shame that Genesis is chapter 1.
Yeah.
It is difficult to explain this to people, and this is why, and I mentioned this before. The Bible was written for priests, right? Like works were made for people, right? Like this is how you reach people: parables, stories, love, healing. You know, the Bible was specifically written for priests, for people that are like very intelligent. Unfortunately, some of those intelligent people manipulate things, right? I don't think it's a bad thing that we all have access to the Bible. I don't want to turn into like, some of the Orthodox like Christians, right? Right. Yeah. Where only some people like still, I mean, even like what Pete Quinones, right, today was like, why we have gay priests is because people can read the Bible for themselves, right?
Right.
And like come to the conclusion that homosexuality is not really a problem based on reading the entire scriptures. That's a great argument for more people reading the Bible, right? In my opinion. But, I also understand that there are moments like this where I just say, like, this is a conversation that a rabbi can understand what's happening in Genesis just fine. Starting your average, like, oh, tell me more about that God of yours, and handing them the book of Genesis, whew, that's a rough
Tough
sale.
sell. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then it's funny because I was thinking in my head and I thought it was ridiculous, but then I thought about it more and I was like, well, no, that actually kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the Bible is written like this, that Genesis specifically is written like this, where the heroes of the story are despicable people, makes me believe in the Bible more. Because if the Bible was written just for propagandic purposes to make people become Christians or become Jews at the time,
right.
Then it wouldn't be so ridiculous. Like it wouldn't be so evil in places, because they would make their heroes out to be heroes. And like they would be explicitly like Superman, like Superman, like ethos of, everybody. Whereas these people are flawed and evil.
Right.
Extorting your brother for food so that you can get his birthright is evil.
Yeah, we come to find out through later chapters that Esau is exaggerating when he says he's starving to death, and he gives. We find out, and Esau is one that gets discussed in like the New Testament stuff. We are not close to done with Esau, even after we're done with Genesis. There's more that we kind of learn about Esau, but like, I am with you. If your brother says he's hungry, he's been out working, even if he's like exaggerating, even if like he does like flippantly give away, like, oh, fine, have my birthright, whatever. Like, okay, but like heck, we even get just like the chapter later when it's actually time to deliver that birthright.
Yeah.
Jacob knows what he did isn't going to hold up, right? Like he knows like that little trade he did, like it's a story that he has to say he legitimately earned it. Nobody else recognizes that that's a legitimate way of taking somebody's birthright, right? Like he has to trick his father because he knows that that's not going to fly. Where he can't argue, oh, Esau traded that away for some soup because he was hungry one day. Nobody's going to recognize that as something that was true. So like it's
just him even offering it as a prospect, even if he knows that it's not a fair agreement that's going to be upheld, is still, I don't know. it rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was going to the chapter 26. We have the same story repeated intergenerationally. Where Isaac is doing the same thing to Abimelech that Abraham did.
Abraham does it twice, and then Isaac tries the same thing. Yeah.
And I'm just like, what is being told here on a meta narrative level? That's being like this, that we're doing this twice.
I mean, the point is that okay. So the point of this, I can tell you from a rabbinical level, the point is that without God's protection, Abimelech just kills them, right? And what happens is God protects them. Abimelech chooses to bless them, chooses not to kill them and have them keep going. So it's it's a miracle story, right? Because it's showing what should have happened versus what actually did happen. Ordinarily, sinful people come face to face with the consequences of their actions. And what are the wages of sin? Death. In this case, probably literally, right? The wages of your sin should literally be death in this time period. I'm not saying that anybody should die for lying about their wife being their sister or something, but in this time period, this is what usually would happen. And this is the story of God's intervention and protection and him filling Abimelech with more love than these people actually deserve. Yeah. And so it's a story that it's just, we're not used to reading stories like this, which is why I think it's so helpful to read it from grab yourself a rabbi. Thankfully, there's a lot of I linked one of them in the Discord group, and maybe I'll just do more. There's a lot of sources from online from Jewish scholars and teachers about this. And yeah, this is generally understanding. They're not trying to be so it's good to trick your enemies. That's not there's no rabbi arguing that, right? That is not the understanding of this passage. The understanding of this passage is that Isaac is doing a bad thing and God is protecting him despite him doing this bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's worse. It's he's not even tricking his enemy. He's tricking his friend, or not friend, but somebody who is friendly to them.
Yeah.
And later on, he's going to trick, the other guy, and whose name I keep mispronouncing.
Laban. Yeah.
Laban. Yeah. And Laban did, I don't know. Maybe I'm not reading the story from the perspective, because Isaac does raise a defense at the end that justifies his behavior somewhat, but I felt like it was cope. But we'll see. So we're on 27 now, where Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob because of Jacob's deception.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote down in my note says, why the deception after 25? You answered that already. That basically that nonsense would stand. But I also wrote, it is Looney Tunes storytelling. And it really does feel like Looney Tunes storytelling.
Too late. I gave the other guy my verbal blessing. Yeah, I just be well, obviously it wasn't intended for him, right?
Right. It's that's very, very okay. Yeah. Well, that wasn't the Looney Tunes part, although that also is Looney Tunes. But the fact that he got some wool or whatever, and
the sheep, the goats, fur. Yeah.
Faking his hairiness and everything that. It was just all very, very silly.
The better to see you with, my dear.
Yeah. But as you said, he gave a verbal blessing, and it's okay, but in modern day, we would call that fraud. You defrauded your father.
Yeah.
And all he gave was a verbal blessing. He could just take it back because it was fraud. It was very clearly fraud. And yet instead, what he does is well, I already said it, so it's too late now to take it back. LOL. Yeah. It's
these are traditions God doesn't care for. You think what's funny is you can tell between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob how much the Jewish tradition values firstborn children, and how little God was that's not the way I'm going to do this, right? That's and so he's goes through these ways to be this is kind of my plan, and my will is being done here despite your traditions. And God shows a contempt. I mean, you will see what he says in Exodus. I think it's Exodus where he says, you guys are the worst. Like you guys are terrible. So yeah, the fun Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jacob the father. Not a great dude. And now I will say this. I do think relatively good for the time period compared to what other people were doing. And I will also say, because the point of these chapters are to emphasize their mistakes, we aren't being told their righteous stuff. We aren't getting a lot of their good guy stories. And the reason is because that's what God says the purpose is not to be like you earned it. God is saying, I chose you, right? Like, not because you're good people, but actually the exact opposite. So it kind of, if we went about telling even like 50-50 stories that make Jacob good and bad, we might just say he's a conflicted good guy, but generally deserved the goodness that came to him, as opposed to God picking him up like, Paul style, right? Like picking him up, smacking him across the face and being like, you are going to do my will, like it or not, right? Like, I am blessing you and your people, and that's the end of it. And this is where like my faith will originate, is in you people, and I guess not like it or not, obviously there's still agency. Obviously we have many stories within these books of people who reject God despite all of this, which is still a bad thing to do. But God is being very blatant about choosing bad people. This is not something that is different as we get to the New Testament. Peter, severe problems. Thomas, problems. Judas, he selects Judas Iscariot, right? Like Jesus, with his perfect knowledge, selects Judas Iscariot as an apostle. Jonah and the whale, or Jonah and the big fish, right? We are full of prophets. Paul, another one. I mean, we're full of people that are not heroes, right? Like, in fact, part of it is God is going above and beyond to show how fallen they exactly are. And this is another example, tricking your dad, into taking your blessing. And this silly little Jewish custom. God was like, hey, Jacob's going to be my guy, right? Like, and to be fair, God says, Ishmael's my guy for a different plan.
Yeah.
Jacob's my guy for this plan, and so I'm gonna do this plan, right? Like with Jacob. We'll see the other sons of Jacob go on to have various plans. Judah, perhaps even more blessed than Joseph and everything. But like, when all's said and done, if we're just counting descendants. But what we're doing here is God's like, I have a plan for everybody, but this is not something you earn. This is something you kind of submit to my will and agree that this will be the best path forward.
Well, and that kind of makes me wonder, like, how much of this is determinism versus free will? Like, or does God have for all of us? Like, does God have I can't tell if you're cutting out or if I'm cutting out, or
something was cutting out. You said
okay. Yeah.
You seem normal now though, so we're okay. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, no, I was just wondering, like, because God is definitely more hands-on in the lives of, like, say, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, than he is in our lives.
So this is an interesting thing, and I loved the Old Testament. It's what I taught when I taught Institute. So I don't want people thinking that I'm just discarding it outright. I just understand the place of the Old Testament. What God is doing here, when we ask ourselves, why does God have such a hands-on approach? There's lots of explanation for this, but to me, God is specifically trying to do something. He's specifically trying to show you will be blessed if I choose you. And the New Testament is, now you have the ability to choose me and also partake in that blessing. One needs to be very hands-on. I chose you, right? You choose me, very hands-off. So there's a reason we have this flip. There's a reason why it's like miracle land in the Old Testament and then all of a sudden, miracles kind of die off. A lot of people are like, oh, that's just because the internet age. Look, the internet's not around, right? Like by the time we stop getting like miracles left and right, there is a reason that this kind of difference occurs. Yeah. And that reason is because God is trying to accomplish something very specific in this. If you read when we went through Revelation, God gets hands-on again, right? Like he needs to accomplish a very specific thing. And so then God gets very hands-on again. So there's a reason why we're kind of in this hands-off era, and why it's a little bit different here. As far as like determinism goes, yeah, if God chooses you, there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do about it. Now, I do believe you are able to reject God despite like God selecting you. We kind of have some instances of that, but it is a pretty wild thing to do. Ultimately, if you've seen God's face and like his truth, it becomes a little difficult to reject God. A little,
Yeah, I was gonna say the only thing I can think of off the top of my head is Jonah, and like Moses, for a while.
Judas Iscariot. I mean, I guess Peter briefly, and there's a few times where like you'd see it, but yeah, generally speaking, and even like Peter, like, and Jonah, like those are like, you kind of think fear, right? Like, as opposed to like, I reject the truth of God. You're just like, I don't want to be the guy.
I don't want to be the guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that makes a lot of sense, but a lot of times God's like, no, man, like you're the perfect guy for this. Please. Like, I want you to do it. We got like Jeremiah, who resents his role in having to do it, but he does do it, and yeah.
Anyway. We're covering a lot of the same ground on 29, 30. The fact that like I guess Jacob gets bait and switched by Laban, providing the wrong daughter, both of which are his cousins, which they mentioned that and they just gloss over it. But I guess Abraham was also inbred, and he married his half sister. So the family tree is a shrub.
Yeah. If you want to look at something kind of beautiful, because we're talking about a lot of ugliness, I really do like the genealogy in Matthew, how it leads off. I mean, the first part of Matthew is just a big genealogy until we get to Jesus. But you look in there and you look at all the step parents, half parents, in-law parents, right? Like adoptive parents, all that stuff, that till we get to the line of Jesus. I think it's really cool that God recognizes, I know I said this in the chat, but I just think it's cool that God recognizes these are families.
Yeah.
If you were to ask God who Jesus's father was, he says Joseph, right? And I think that that's amazing. Like, that's a beautiful thing for families that are kind of fractured. I know that there's a lot of people that like finding out they're adopted feels like bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not. Like, it's like God does not view, like,
honestly,
he views you as every bit as somebody's kid is their kid,
It's even more so because, if you're your biological child of somebody, they're kind of obligated to take care of you. Whereas if you're an adopted child of somebody, that means that they loved you enough to choose, like, specifically choose you.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's true. No, and that's something that, I mean, even biological kids like think every so often, I don't know why you had me, right? Like, whereas that's something an adopted child doesn't have to ask themselves. I think it's one of those, I like talking about that. I like talking about the good news, and that's one that strikes me as remarkably good news. That like this one and like animals going to heaven, right? Like, is remarkably grounded in the scriptures. We'll see this in both the Old and New Testament, that animals go to heaven. And I think it's one of those, it's like, you don't get often to kind of, I mean, look at what we're reading right now. We're having kind of a big crack in the face, right? Like, when we're reading this, but there are like still kind of magical, things that you would believe if you were 3 years old and you would want them to be true, that actually are true in the Gospels. And, yeah, I think being part of a mishmash shrub family, as you put it, God still respects that as part of your family, and he regards you that way enough to enshrine it into scripture and to think about you that way in heaven. So there you go. Your family is your family. If you choose to have a falling out with your family,
And like,
yeah.
I'm gonna try to poke at the Bible, I guess, for a bit there. And
Yeah.
you've been explaining a lot of this, and so 30 was kind of the capstone for me on.
Is
30. I had a lot
30?
of Genesis 30.
Is this Laban or is this Rachel? Oh, it's Rachel and Leah getting jealous of each other and presenting their concubines and
Yeah,
all that.
presenting their
Yeah,
concubines, and then specifically Rachel saying, "Then God has vindicated me, has listened to my plea, and given me a son through the concubine." And obviously, based on what you're saying now, this is not God's will. This
right.
is Leah's will, using God as a proxy. Um, and so that kind of explains itself. But I wrote Genesis 30 is overall is just messy and mean spirited, super toxic. Um, and then specifically when we get to the part with Laban,
Yeah,
like Laban, so Jacob makes the argument that you made me work for 7 years, you bait and switched me and gave me the wrong sister, and then you made me work for 7 more years to get to the sister that I actually wanted, and then 4 years to get the flock.
yeah,
But that's the argument that he makes. But he also specifically set the terms for that argument, or set the terms for that 7 years. I'll work for you for 7 years for the sister. So the
yeah,
only thing that really Laban could have potentially done that was sketchy was give the wrong sister under the conditions that he knew that he was never going to give the correct sister the first time because of their local
yeah,
customs, which is definitely something like 7 years of labor is a long time. And I do like the fact that it's 7 years because Jubilee and every 7 years and everything like that. That's the reason why it's broken up in 7 year segments.
yeah,
That's cool. But other than that one thing, which I'm not going to discount that's a big deal. 7 years of labor is a long time, even when you're living 180 years old or whatever. 7 years is still a long time. But other than that, everything we read about Laban made him up to see a pretty stand-up guy. And meanwhile, you've got Jacob, and Jacob's like, as soon as he finds out that he can get the flock, if he has like if they have a speckles or whatever on the sheep or whatever, he starts like, I didn't really fully understand what was being done, but it was like he was genetically engineering the sheep to only be speckled so that he could like grift the entirety of Laban's flock away from him. And then he goes and skips out in the middle of the night, taking both the wives, and just completely abandons Laban. And it's just like, why would you treat this guy this way? Laban was like, he ran after him and he was angry, but it was more like he was super disappointed. He's like, why would you treat me like this? And God is meanwhile interfering on Laban's behalf to stop him from interfering with Jacob. And I just like, I don't
yeah.
get it. I don't
There's
get it.
So let me add some things with Laban that I think will put you more in Jacob's camp or here. Laban does reduce Jacob's profit or the share that Jacob gets. We're told 10 different times.
Yeah.
And we're told that, like, because if he says like, okay, you can have a tenth of the sheep since you're the one doing the work, and then he changes it to a 20th, a 30th, a 100th, right? Like, keeps Jacob at this flatline low value, despite Laban reaping exponential values, right? And so you are correct that, like, he's like, well, I tell you what, let's take you keep changing my wages. So what Jacob's doing here is he's like, I know a way to get speckled sheep. I'll just say, or goats or whatever. Can I have the speckled ones, right? And then orchestrates a situation in which he can get speckled goats as kind of payback for the fact that Laban has been profiting off of all of his labor. 7 years literally stolen from him, right? Like, for the wife part, another 7 years that Jacob was gracious enough to give. And then he's also reducing Jacob's profit from his own work, right? Like Jacob is doing more work as the flocks get bigger, right? Like his work amount has expanded. Jacob mentions this. And he's like, I am having to work harder as you're getting more powerful. You're not having to work at all, right? And you have the nerve to keep reducing my wages so that I'm still at the same place as I was before. And now you're mad if you just say like, oh, let's take the randomness out of it. And it, like, you know, you get the speckled ones. And then Laban changed that too. Was like, actually, you can have the striped ones. And then Jacob figures out how to make them striped. And then he's like, okay, now you can have the solid colored ones. Jacob figures out a way around that, right? Like Laban is trying to wriggle his way out of free labor. I think that it's also very telling that both of the sisters, and we're not told why, but are like, yeah, my father's a scuzzbag. We should get out of here without saying goodbye to him. It's funny because Laban's like, you left without me saying goodbye to my daughters. It was the daughter's idea. They were scared of their father. And so I do think that there is something to be said for, I don't know. We're not told if, you know, outside of Laban being like a very scummy like person to work for, what he did, but appears to at least be scary enough that
gotcha. So I was skimming enough that I missed some crucial details.
Yeah, I mean, it's still Jacob. This is still trickster stuff, you know, as you said. And I do think there is something to be said for the fact, I think it would be nice if Jacob was like, hey, can I just have a tenth of them and let's get out of here? I don't think that that's necessarily wrong. I don't think Laban would have agreed to it. And then we have, you know, actual war as opposed to Jacob, you know what I mean? Like just getting his fair share. So Laban's not generally regarded in kind terms in the Bible, which is why I think God actually steps in to help Jacob on this one. Yeah, I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And how you feel about, and I feel about big business people profiting off of do nothings, profiting off of the do everythings, you know, sure. And sitting back on it. And that is certainly what Laban is trying to do. Do you have anything else there? Genesis 30 there?
No, that was the end of my notes. I didn't have anything on the most recent reading that we read today.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah. Well, we have just enough time. I just wanted to give one last final pitch about diversity. As people are watching us, since we're getting more viewers than we had at the beginning here, I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I, coming from a conservative side, my dad was a conservative side. My dad's still a registered Republican. He thinks the Republicans have lost their mind, but he's one of those, I've been a Republican forever. So I'm just, you know.
Inertia.
I want them to return to their values, but he's still, you know, and he doesn't vote for the Republicans, to be clear. So I don't want to make it sound like my dad's like right wing. But do you remember, like, this is kind of old, and so maybe before your time, but when like NASA was like, when Obama told NASA their first objective was to like get the Muslim community more involved. And my dad was like, that's not what NASA's really for, right? Like my dad's an aerospace engineer and was kind of like, ugh, you know, and we're dealing, it's funny because it's called DEI now, but we just called it affirmative action back then, right? So like, you know, this is how we, you know, kind of learned about affirmative action. Of course, my dad and I, being somewhat right wing, we're just like, we should just select the smartest people. My dad has this really amazing story that changed his mind. And my dad changed his mind while he was still a conservative. So the way that this story goes, and we're still conservative afterward. I was still conservative afterward. But he hired somebody who was a Muslim basically because he had to. Now, did this person qualify for all the minimums? Yes. There are certain minimums that people have to hit, you know, and if they don't hit those minimums, then they're not hired. Right. So this person had all the minimum experience, but he went to, you know, an Arab school. I think it was Saudi Arabia. Right. But went to a university over there and was like, all right, well, I have to hire somebody who's Muslim. So let's take him on. And this guy came in and was able to, you know, do everything that everybody else was able to do. A little bit of a culture, you know, trying to iron out all that. All right. Aaron has to go put the kiddo to bed and his culture dropped out, but his connection dropped out, but that's okay. Love you, Aaron. Thank you, buddy. Appreciate you joining us here. So what happened was this guy was like, well, what I learned in school was this different kind of, and this is all above my pay grade. My dad is probably going to yell at me for explaining this wrong, but basically a different way of doing propulsion that was more fuel efficient as it was leaving the atmosphere. And it was that difference in education. He wasn't smarter than any of them, right? Than anybody there. But it was just that different background, that different style of education that, and they could have said no, and then he'd still be capable of doing all the work of just building the same old rockets that they were doing before. But my dad, after that point, was just like, that was invaluable. And what he started doing when he was hiring people is looking for those people with those different backgrounds. Now, of course, everybody had to do the minimum, right? Because if they went with one direction in a project, they all had to be capable of doing the equations. He specifically was involved in design, right? So everybody has to be able to understand design and work together. Everybody has to be capable of those equations. But diversity, yeah, even if this person's not the smartest of the batch, having that new background, those new experiences added something to the project. And he found that when he did this with women and Jews, Muslims, people that were, especially Black people, right? Like people that were not traditionally involved with aerospace, so long as they were all capable of doing the calculations, that they added something to the project that made it better than before. Diversity is an incredible thing. And we really shouldn't disparage it. I am sad to see that so many Christians are disparaging diversity today. I understand the desire to just hire the most qualified person for the job. I do. And government, to be fair, is really bad at this, because what they just say is hire 50% men, 50% women. When you do something like that, something my dad noted when he was hiring people, the problem is if you say hire 10 Muslims, I don't care. What the people who hire are going to do is they're going to just take Muslims, 10 of them, but with the most mainstream formal education that they could find. And what made the person special wasn't the fact that they were Muslim, is that they had those Muslim experiences. It was that education from Saudi Arabia, right? And so if these women go to these same institutions as men, then you're just hiring them because they're women, right? Like, what makes them unique is these different experiences, these different backgrounds, these different ways of thinking that coalesced with the group, but you needed them to be different. Instead, what he found is that people are just hiring women that just weren't as qualified, but have all the same experiences as men, because you have to hit 50% women, right? Like, as opposed to hiring 50% women, still a good idea, but like specifically looking for experiences that makes them unique. I wrote about the Iditarod recently. Now, in your head, if you think of an Iditarod winning dog sled team, now, if you're anything like me, you just picture a bunch of Huskies, right? Like the uniform Husky look. Look up the winning dog teams for the last decade plus of the Iditarod. Mixed breeds, yellow labs, Huskies, German Shepherds, and as well as mixes. I mean, just a bunch of mix. Now, there are certain minimums, right? Like you won't see a Chihuahua on there, because they do need to be able to have a certain amount of strength, stamina, endurance, right? Like when I call for diversity, I'm not calling for eliminating minimums, right? But what made these people successful, and if you watch this episode of Dirty Jobs from Mike Rowe, you'll actually see this explained. It's the cohesion of these different individuals that makes the group successful. That each team has an enforcer and an organizer and a peacemaker, and it's these different individual dogs that make the group perfect. None of the dogs are the same. Like, they all have these different mentalities. Of course, they're all the same as far as being competitive and winning races. That's important, right? But where they differ is how they go about it. And if you have no enforcer, then you're going to have a bad dog sled team. If you have all enforcers, you're going to have a bad dog sled team. You need just some individualism there. You need that right balance, right? So you need to get that diverse group to be successful. And that is true whether you're building rockets or building a dog sled team, is the power of diversity. And so when we as Christians just kind of say like they should just do the most qualified ones, well, I can tell right there, sports teams from this especially, we should just get the strongest, most talented athletes. The Raiders have been bad forever doing exactly that. Who's the fastest person in the draft? Who's the tallest person? Who's got the most talent? Who's the best on paper? Who's the most athletically gifted? Right. Okay, great. You've got the most talented player. What does that net you? The worst record in the National Football League over the last like 30 years or however long they've been doing it, right? Okay, that doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We want it to work. I understand the desire for meritocracy, for earning where you are in the world. That's not what does work. We talked about earlier, talking about the fruits of the Spirit, right? Like, where are your fruits at? You might say, yeah, I just hired the best, and boy, I've just got the same old, same old. Not good enough. What is good enough is when you focus, you make diversity a priority. Don't make it everything. Like I said, I'm not asking that you put a Chihuahua on your dog sled team, and I'm not asking that you put somebody who dropped out of elementary school in your aerodynamics program, right? Like, neither of those two, right? But if you've got somebody who's got the minimums, you really do need to diversify. Everybody on a sports team is athletic, right? But the sports teams that are successful, man, they have identity, right? Like that quarterback has an identity, wide receivers with identities, and they're not all the same identity, right? Like different personalities going all throughout the organization, you know? Like everybody notes like, oh, that kicker is a little weird. Oh, this running back doesn't like to talk to the media. Oh, that's strange. Oh, like, yeah, because it takes all kinds, right? And the more that you're able to draw from all kinds, the stronger your organization is going to be. Like I said, you can pull this from different things, but this is no different from Christians. I actively seek out people who have a different perspective than me. I want them to have a voice on what Christianity gets to look like moving forward. I don't want it to look like me. I want myself to be a piece of that. I want to have my identity in that. When they talk about you being the body of Christ in the Bible, some people are eyes, some people are heels, some people are arms. You don't want your eye to behave like a heel. You don't want your eye to be all calloused over and tough. You don't want your heel to behave like an eye. You don't want it to be all soft and squishy. But we need soft and squishy people in the right places, and we need the hard and callous people in the right places, you know? And so this is the diversity that we need, you know, whether it's Christianity or sports or whatever, or, you know, the Iditarod, whatever it may be. So I just want to, I want to push forward the idea that diversity is a good thing. And I just hope that more Christians can understand that. Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in this week. Join the Love First Christians. A link is in the description of this video. We would love to have you. It's a free Discord group. It is just a great place to have tons of conversations like this. We are reading the Bible in 1 year. We're only 4% done with the Bible. So if you just say like, I missed my chance, not even close. We still got the bulk of the thing to go. And honestly, you could probably take 2 hours and catch up with where we are in the Bible. Like really? So, you know, it's a great time to get started. Anyhow, I hope you're blessed. I look forward to seeing y'all next week, and have a great day.